The midday sun blazed over the frontier town of Red Rock, hammering down on the timber roofs and shimmering dust of the main street. Wagons creaked past. Horses stamped their hooves impatiently, and men in broad hats wiped sweat from their brows as if the sky itself sought to burn them alive. Amid that sweltering heat, the air thickened with something more than dust. Rumor. A sale was taking place, one that made even hardened gamblers and whiskey-soaked drifters lean against posts to watch. A tall cowboy named Samuel Hart rode in from the desert trail. His duster coat was faded, his boots scarred by years of grit, but his eyes, gray and steady, were sharper than any revolver. He had the look of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. People turned when he dismounted in front of the trading post. They had reason to watch. The town knew Samuel as a man of solitary habits, never one to waste coin on fancy things. Yet here he was, coins jangling in his pocket, striding toward the wooden platform where a chained Apache woman stood. She was young, but her silence carried the weight of centuries. Her raven-black hair tumbled over her shoulders, her wrists bound by iron cuffs that cut into skin the color of warm earth. The auctioneer barked numbers, sweat dripping from his jowls. Men in the crowd snickered, some whispering about what they'd do if fortune were kinder. Others muttered disapproval. Red Rock prided itself on being civilized, though the truth was written in scars and blood. Samuel's jaw tightened as he watched. The woman lifted her chin, eyes dark and unyielding, refusing to let shame bend her spine. That defiance stirred something in him. He had buried comrades after raids, seen the smoke of burned villages drift like funeral veils. Yet here stood a soul refusing to break. $50! A rancher shouted, his voice hoarse with lust. 60, another countered, earning laughter from his companions. The auctioneer grinned, calling for higher bids. The crowd pressed closer, eager to see who would win this cruel contest. Samuel's hand slid into his coat. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might reach for the revolver at his hip. But instead he pulled out a leather pouch. The clink of gold coins silenced the murmurs. 100, Samuel said, his voice like gravel rolled in thunder. The street went still. The rancher's smirk faltered, the gambler's laughter dried up. Even the horses shifted uneasily, sensing a change in the air. $100 was more than most men made in a year, and Samuel had just thrown it down for a woman in chains. The auctioneer stepped forward, his boots grinding in the dust. He pulled a small iron key from the auctioneer's fat fingers and unlocked the shackles. The sound of metal falling against wood echoed louder than church bells. The woman did not flinch. She looked at him, her eyes fierce, and for a moment the whole world seemed to narrow to that gaze. "You're free now," Samuel muttered. But freedom was a lie in Red Rock. The townsfolk would not see her as free, only as property moved from one hand to another. Samuel knew this, and still, he led her down from the platform. The crowd parted reluctantly, whispers chasing them like rattlesnakes slithering through dry grass. They walked together toward the saloon, not as master and slave, but as two figures bound by something unspoken. The town did not yet know the truth, that Samuel Hart had no intention of keeping her as property. What he carried inside him was not desire for dominance, but a fire that had burned too long in silence. The need to defy the rules of a land built on cruelty. Inside the dim saloon, where the air reeked of whiskey and tobacco, Samuel ordered water for her before he touched his own glass. Men stared from their tables, cards forgotten in their hands. She sat across from him, her back straight, her hands resting on the rough wood. "What's your name?" he asked. For the first time, her lips parted. Her voice was low, but it carried across the hushed room. "Ahyoka." The name lingered in the air like a prayer. Samuel nodded slowly, as though sealing a pact no one else could hear. Outside, the town of Red Rock buzzed with disbelief, already spinning stories that would spread like wildfire. A cowboy had bought the most beautiful Apache woman at auction, but no one yet realized what he intended to do next. The next morning, Red Rock woke to a storm of voices. The dusty streets that usually rang with the clang of horseshoes and the chatter of merchants now pulsed with one name: Samuel Hart. Men muttered over their coffee mugs, women paused at the well with buckets dangling in their hands, and even children sensed the tension in the air. What had happened at the auction was spreading faster than prairie fire. Every corner of the town now knew that a cowboy had paid $100 for an Apache woman and had walked her away in plain sight of everyone. The blacksmith, a thick-armed man named Keller, shook his head as he hammered an iron shoe into shape. "That fool's gone and cursed himself," he spat. "A white man taking an Apache woman? He'll bring ruin down on us all." At the general store, Miss Cartwright fanned herself with a scrap of newspaper, her lips pursed tight. "Mark my words," she told the cluster of women hanging on her words. "She'll hex him in his sleep. Those people carry old magic in their blood. No decent man marries a savage." Meanwhile, in the saloon, whispers flowed with the whiskey. Samuel sat at a corner table, hat pulled low, Ahyoka beside him. She had not left his side since the auction, and that alone stirred tongues. Cards slapped against tabletops, dice clattered, but every now and then a man's eyes darted their way with a mix of suspicion and something darker. "You think he's touched in the head?" one gambler murmured to another. "No," came the reply. "He's worse. He's defying every rule we live by." Samuel felt their stares, but he did not flinch. He had known the streets would turn against him. What surprised him was the quiet strength in Ahyoka's gaze. She never bowed her head, never shrank from the venom in their eyes. Instead, she met their hatred with a silence so unyielding it became a shield. Still, Samuel knew silence alone could not protect her. As the day wore on, small acts of hostility surfaced. The bartender hesitated before serving them drinks. A ranch hand spat near their boots as they passed by. Children were pulled away by anxious mothers as though the very sight of Ahyoka would stain them. By dusk, the air grew heavier, the town waiting for something to break. That was when Sheriff Malden appeared. A broad man with a gut that strained his vest, Malden prided himself on keeping Red Rock orderly. He pushed through the saloon doors, spurs jangling, his eyes narrowing when they landed on Samuel and the woman beside him. "Samuel Hart," the sheriff drawled, voice oily with authority. "Mind if I sit?" Samuel didn't answer. The sheriff sat anyway, dragging out the chair across from them. "Words out you paid a fortune for—" "That's a problem." Samuel's hand tightened around his glass. "The problem isn't mine." "It's theirs," Malden smirked. "See, that's where you're wrong. Everything that happens in Red Rock is my problem. You walk around with her, make a spectacle of it, and decent folks start asking questions. They ask if you're planning to marry her, God forbid." He leaned closer, breath sour with whiskey. "Tell me that ain't true." Ahyoka's eyes flashed, but Samuel's voice was steady. What I do with my life is none of this town's business. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then leaned back. Careful, Hart. You keep pushing and you'll find this place has a way of chewing men up. Some call it justice. I call it survival. With that, Malden stood, tipping his hat mockingly to Ahyoka before swaggering out. The room buzzed with renewed whispers. That night, Samuel and Ahyoka left the saloon together, the street lamps casting long shadows behind them. The town was quieter, but not at peace. Faces watched from windows, eyes gleaming with curiosity, fear, and judgment. Samuel guided her toward the small cabin he kept on the edge of town. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather. Samuel lit a lamp, its glow warming the rough-hewn walls. For the first time since the auction, Ahyoka spoke more than a single word. "Why did you do it?" she asked softly, her voice carrying both suspicion and wonder. Samuel looked at her, weary lines carved deep into his face. "Because I've seen chains before. Once, I wore them myself. Not iron, but rules. Wars fought in other men's names. Orders I had to follow. I swore I'd never let another soul live that way while I still breathed." Ahyoka studied him, her eyes searching for the lie. She found none. Slowly she nodded, as though acknowledging something sacred. Outside, the coyotes howled, their cries carried on the desert wind. In the streets of Red Rock, whispers still spread like wildfire, but inside the cabin, two unlikely souls shared a silence that was no longer heavy. It was alive with the promise of defiance. The first light of dawn spread across Red Rock like a pale wash of fire, brushing the desert with colors of rust and gold. The town was just stirring, shopkeepers unbolting doors, ranch hands heading toward the corrals, when the rumor struck like a rattlesnake's bite. Samuel Hart intended to marry the Apache woman. The words hissed from mouth to mouth, each retelling sharper than the last. By the time the church bell tolled 7, half the town had heard. By 8, all of Red Rock buzzed with outrage. "An abomination," muttered Reverend Cole, his white collar gleaming as he stomped through the street. "The Lord will not suffer such sin under his roof." At the barber's chair, a cattleman spat into the sawdust. "If Hart does it, he'll shame every man here. Make us look weak." The whispers swelled, thick as the morning dust. Some voices seethed with anger, others with fear, but curiosity, sharp and hungry, kept them from turning away. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered near the chapel, pressing close, eyes wide with disbelief. Samuel walked through them, tall and steady, his coat brushing against the bodies that shifted back with sneers and muttered curses. Beside him, Ahyoka walked with the same poise she had shown on the auction platform, her chin raised, her dark eyes cutting through the crowd like arrows. Each step was defiance. Each breath was a vow. The chapel doors loomed ahead. Reverend Cole blocked the entrance, Bible clutched tight in his fist. His face glistened with sweat, not from the sun but from fury. "This is madness, Hart," the Reverend thundered. "You cannot bring a savage into God's house, let alone bind yourself to her in holy matrimony. It is against Scripture, against decency." Samuel's voice was calm, though every eye strained to hear. "Scripture also says we are all children of the same Maker. If that's true, then she is as worthy as any of us." The Reverend's face turned scarlet. "Blasphemy!" The crowd gasped, tension snapping like dry twigs. A hand twitched toward a revolver, another toward a knife. But Samuel's gray eyes swept over them, cold and unflinching. He was not a man asking permission. He was a man declaring war against their prejudice. Ahyoka stepped forward then, her voice clear and ringing. The first time many in Red Rock had heard her speak. I will not bow to chains again. If this man chooses me, it is because he sees me, not as a slave, not as a savage, but as a woman. Her words cracked the silence like thunder. Even the most hardened ranch hands shifted uneasily. They had expected her silence, candle wax and dust. Samuel and Ahyoka stood before the altar. "Reverend or no reverend," Samuel said quietly, "we'll speak our vows." He turned to her, removing his hat, his weathered face solemn in the dim light. "I've lived with silence, with shadows, with the weight of blood on my hands. But when I saw you stand unbroken, I knew I had to fight for something greater. Ahyoka, I take you as my wife, not as possession, but as partner. From this day, whatever comes, we stand together." Ahyoka lifted her chin, eyes glistening yet fierce. "Samuel Hart, I take you as husband, not because you freed me, but because you see me. Where there is desert, we will bring water. Where there is fire, we will endure. I am no man's property. I choose you." A hush fell over the chapel. No paper was signed, no priest blessed the union, yet something heavier than law sealed their words. From the back, a voice snarled, "This ain't no marriage. This is treason against our kind." The room erupted, shouts, curses, the scrape of boots on wood. A bottle shattered against the floor. The sheriff barged in, face red with fury, revolver strapped heavy at his side. "Enough!" Malden bellowed. "This mockery ends now." Samuel turned, his body angled protectively before Ahyoka. The tension in the room coiled like a rattler ready to strike. Dust swirled through the chapel windows, glowing in the sunlight like drifting embers. For a breathless moment it seemed Red Rock itself held its breath, waiting to see if love or violence would reign. The chapel trembled with a roar of voices. Men surged forward, fists clenched, boots stomping against the wooden floorboards like war drums. The women shrieked, some pulling children out into the street, others staying only to watch the scandal unfold. Samuel Hart stood unmoved, his tall frame casting a shadow over Ahyoka, who remained steady beside him. Sheriff Malden's voice cut through the chaos. "This marriage is no marriage. It's a disgrace, and I won't have Red Rock torn apart because one man thinks he's above the law." His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, fingers itching. Samuel's gray eyes locked on him. "The law?" His voice was calm, almost too calm. "You speak of law, Sheriff, but what law is this? That a man cannot choose his wife? That a woman cannot be free? If that's law, then it is chains dressed in velvet." The crowd hissed, muttered, cursed. Some men cheered Malden on, calling Samuel a traitor, a fool, a madman. Others held back, uncertain, unsettled by the quiet conviction in the cowboy's tone. Ahyoka's voice rang out suddenly, firm and clear. "Your anger is not about law. It is about fear. You fear what it means if I stand as equal. You fear what it means if love crosses the lines you drew in sand. You fear freedom." For a heartbeat, silence fell. Even Malden's lips tightened as if struck. But then rage surged back into the room. "Enough talk," shouted Keller the blacksmith, shoving forward. His hammer-thick arms reached for Samuel, But Samuel stepped aside and drove his fist into Keller's gut. The big man staggered, wheezing. The crowd howled, the chapel exploding into violence. Men lunged at Samuel. He swung, ducked, shoved, his movements sharp, efficient, born of years surviving battlefields and barroom brawls. A chair splintered across his back, yet he did not fall. He fought not like a man defending only himself, but as though defending something greater, something sacred. Through the chaos, Ahyoka remained unbowed. A man lunged for her arm, snarling, but she snatched up a broken piece of wood and swung. The blow cracked across his face, sending him reeling. Gasps filled the chapel. No one expected the slave woman to strike back. The sheriff finally drew his gun. The metallic click silenced the frenzy for a moment. His revolver gleamed in the morning light slanting through the chapel windows. "Stand down, Hart," Malden barked, "or I'll put you in the ground." Samuel straightened, chest heaving, sweat streaking down his face. He raised his hands, not in surrender but in defiance. "Then you'll prove my point to the last man."
Iron.
Ahyoka stepped forward, standing beside Samuel. Her small frame dwarfed by him, but her presence blazing just as fiercely. She slipped her hand into his. "If you kill him, Sheriff, you kill me too. And you kill what little honor this town has left." The sheriff's jaw clenched. His gun remained raised, but sweat pooled on his brow. For all his bluster, he had not expected this. Two souls standing together, unbroken before his authority. From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Let him be, Malden." Heads turned. It was old Mrs. Greeley, the widow who ran the boarding house. Her face was lined with years of sorrow, yet her eyes burned bright. "What harm is there in two people choosing each other?" "The harm is in us, in our hate." Another voice joined, shaky but resolute. She spoke truth. "We're afraid. Maybe too afraid." The tide began to shift, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Men who had come ready to fight now shuffled their feet, uncertain. Malden's grip on his revolver faltered as he sensed control slipping. Samuel's voice rose, steady and commanding. "We stand here not asking for your blessing, but refusing your chains. If you cannot abide that, then do what you must. But know this, you'll never break us." The chapel seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff's finger twitched on the trigger, the weight of choice heavy in the air. The crowd leaned forward, caught between violence and revelation. Outside, the church bell rang, its toll rolling over Red Rock like a warning and a promise. Dogs barked, horses reared, and even the desert wind seemed to pause, carrying the echo across the town. On the boardwalks, townsfolk who hadn't dared enter the chapel clustered in anxious knots, waiting for the sound of gunfire. Mothers held children close, and old men stared grimly at the horizon, muttering that Red Rock had never seen a day like this. Inside, Malden's revolver remained raised, but his arm quivered. The sheriff was not only fighting Samuel, he was fighting the shift in the very ground beneath his boots. The town was slipping from his control, bending toward something he could not crush with bullets. For the first time, Samuel saw doubt flicker in Malden's eyes. The sheriff's authority was a mask, and that mask was cracking. The sheriff's revolver hung in the balance, a black weight between law and rebellion. The crowd inside the chapel leaned forward, breaths caught, as if the entire town were suspended on the edge of a single heartbeat. Malden's finger trembled on the trigger. He wanted to fire, to reassert control, to remind Red Rock that no man nor woman defied his order. But as his eyes swept the faces around him, he found less support than he expected. Too many looked away. Too many had heard the fire in Ahyoka's voice, had seen Samuel stand unyielding, and something in them had shifted. With a snarl, the sheriff holstered his gun. "This ain't over, Hart," he spat, "not by a long shot." He shoved past the crowd and stormed into the street, his spurs jangling like angry bells. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the church bell still tolling. Then, slowly, people began to drift out, muttering, glancing over their shoulders. What had begun as outrage had become uncertainty, and uncertainty was more dangerous than hate. Samuel exhaled, the tension easing from his shoulders. He turned to Ahyoka. Her dark eyes were steady, her hand still in his. Neither had spoken vows blessed by law or priest, but they both knew the bond between them was stronger than either. For the next days, Red Rock simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. Whispers trailed them wherever they went. Some townsfolk kept their distance, others hurled insults under their breath, but there were also quiet nods, subtle gestures of respect, small cracks in the wall of prejudice. One evening, Samuel and Ahyoka walked along the desert edge. The sun bled red across the horizon, and the coyotes sang in the distance. Samuel stopped, his boots crunching in the sand. "You don't have to stay," he said softly. "The world beyond Red Rock is wide. If you wanted to leave, I'd understand." Ahyoka studied him for a long time. Then she shook her head. "I was bound by chains once. I won't let fear bind me again. My place is not in running, it is in choosing. And I choose here. I choose you." Her words struck him deeper than any bullet. Samuel nodded, unable to speak for a moment, and drew her close. Under the desert sky, their shadows merged into one. But destiny, like the desert, is never still. 2 weeks later, riders came into Red Rock. Apache men, weary from travel, their faces marked with paint of mourning and war. They sought the woman taken from them. Whispers swept through the town like wind through dry grass. The tribe had come for Ahyoka. The meeting took place at dawn, on the open plain beyond the town. Others lingered, hesitant, as though uncertain what justice meant anymore. Ahyoka stepped forward before Samuel could answer. "Home?" she said, her voice carrying. "My home is not a place stolen or burned. My home is where I choose to stand. And I stand here." The Apache men exchanged uneasy glances. Some scowled, others softened. The leader's eyes narrowed. "You would choose him? A man not of your blood? You would bind yourself to a world that scorned you." Her chin rose. "I choose love, not chains. Not yours, not theirs. Mine." Her words fell into the still air like arrows. The riders stirred, caught between pride and respect. A young warrior muttered in their tongue, and Samuel, though he did not know the words, felt the weight of their meaning. Silence hung over the plain, broken only by the wind. Finally, the leader bowed his head. "Then your destiny is your own." With a gesture, he turned his horse, and the riders melted back into the horizon, leaving dust and echoes behind. Samuel let out a long breath. Ahyoka's hand slipped into his, warm and certain. Around them, the desert stretched endless, harsh and beautiful. In Red Rock, they would still face hatred, suspicion, perhaps worse. Behind shuttered windows, townsfolk debated whether Samuel had cursed them or redeemed them. The saloon filled with arguments, the church with whispers, and the sheriff with plans no one yet knew. But Samuel and Ahyoka no longer walked as outcast and prisoner. They walked as partners, their bond tempered in fire. From slave to bride, from silence to defiance, Ahyoka had seized her destiny. And Samuel, once a man of shadows, had found his light in her. The town's whispers would not vanish overnight. Yet somewhere in those whispers, a seed had been planted. A story had begun, of love that dared the desert, that challenged the law, that refused the chains of fear. And as the sun rose higher over Red Rock, painting the sky in gold, it was clear. Their fight was only beginning, but so was their freedom.